the elk was hamstrung. And so I don't think I mean, it's always really hard, right, to know the reason why wolves do something. Like, are they doing it for fun? And for me, it makes sense because dogs, you throw a chew toy, dog chases it, right?
Listen, we found each other off of Instagram, and I've been posting a lot of videos from Idaho Fish and Game, a lot of different sides of the issue. I try to focus. Idaho Fish and Game is one of those things that is so heavily relied on. People really enjoy the wildlife and the fish and game in this state, but Idaho Fish and Game itself doesn't have a great voice, and it doesn't have a really great way to explain, especially with the expanding and changing demographic in the state. It doesn't really have a way to say like, hey guys, listen, this is what's going on in the state. This is how it's been functioning. This is where you come in this whole big piece of it. And so, I've been posting a lot of that stuff, and you reached out to me and were like, hey, I'm, a hunter. I have this platform. This is my style. And so here we are. So I'm super pumped to talk to you about what you do.
Absolutely. Hey, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. And it's a different area. So it's good to get a different perspective of Idaho too. Cause, remind me again, you're kind of you said Treasure Valley. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm like 25 minutes away from Boise and in the Eagle area.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess my only real long experience I've had in Southern Idaho is I went to school in Rexburg. So
there you go.
For a little bit. So
yeah. And again, I have not had the opportunity to explore as much as I would have liked in Northern Idaho either. So, it's a big state. That's one of the other things. People that I've spoken with don't realize how big Idaho is. And if you flattened it out, it would be like this mammoth thing. I mean, my dad lived up in Alaska for about 25 years. So I do have some perspective with really large places that have large uninhabited areas and a lot of just outdoor stuff, obviously fish and game hunting and just wildlife. So you're a wolf hunter though. You're a big fan of wolf hunting. Talk to me about this.
Yes, absolutely. So what got me into wolf hunting, honestly, it wasn't even intentional at the time, but I consider myself a really passionate elk and mule deer hunter, right? And so, and I say, I still consider myself a youngster. I'm in my mid 30s, but I still feel like I lived the good old days in the early 2000s. When I was a teenager, we had a lot of wildlife, and kind of to describe the North Idaho landscape, we have a lot of vegetation. We have, like you go to Southern Idaho and it doesn't seem like you guys have a lot of vegetation. You got sagebrush, you got junipers and some other things. But when you go to North Idaho, you have not just hundreds, but thousands of different species of plants and shrubbery that holds a lot of wildlife and we get a lot more moisture too. And so we don't get near as much droughts. But the one thing we will suffer with sometimes is we get hard winters. You guys do that as well sometimes too. So I do have that.
Not like Northern Idaho. Not like that. Yeah. And I mean, like we have winter here. I remember moving up here and, there was some conversation about like, oh, how do we prepare our cars for, hard freezes and what do we do with, whatever. And, I was, chatting with my wife and then friends were like, you don't understand. Like I've hung out in Anchorage. Anchorage has winters. Like you have 4-foot snowbanks at the end of May. Like that's winter. Like we're going to a place that has, 12 inches of precipitation annually. Even if we get some dusting of snow, it's not going to be the same thing. MTU Studios is the proud producer for the Ada County Sheriff Podcast, the Idaho Wildlife Federation Podcast, the State Representative Ted Hill Podcast, the Idaho State PTA Podcast, and many more. If you or your organization is thinking about starting a podcast, MTU Studios would love to help. Just check out mtustudios.com.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So what I'm talking about, because some areas, especially start getting in the mountains, we'll get 10 feet plus, right, pretty quick. Yeah. And so it can make our wildlife pretty vulnerable, especially in the winter times, but for the most part, we do have, we have the habitat to sustain a fair amount of wildlife. And I got to see that growing up. And I'd say it wasn't until it was about 2007 is when I saw my first wolf. And we were mule deer hunting. This is an area where I would expect to see close to a little over a dozen deer a day. It's a draw where they just kind of funnel through, and there is actually it was an older burn, so the vegetation was perfect, the habitat was great, muleys loved it. But like in this one particular day, it was almost desolate, but that didn't mean much to us at the time. We're just like, oh, it's just maybe an off day, right? Like there was no tracks moving through. It's like, that's kind of weird. Usually there's a lot of mule deer in this spot. And so we were teenagers at the time, and we thought, as dumb teenagers are, we're like, well, let's just shoot one bullet across the canyon and hit a rock and see if we can get a deer to bump up, because there's some tiny little timber patches that never got burnt up in that fire. And so anyways, we shot across the canyon, and that was probably my first experience in seeing a wolf. The big black wolf jumped out of the timber and just ran right down the mountain, straight down. And I was just like, I just couldn't believe the size that a wolf can get. That was like my first experience of seeing a wolf and being like, holy smokes, that dog is huge. Like, it's bigger than most deer I see. You know what I mean? And I'm looking at this wolf at 400 yards running down the hill, and I could see it like perfectly. I could see its tail, I could see its ears, everything. It's just a big dog running down this hillside. And since then, I've never seen that area have the mule deer numbers like it used to. It's like as soon as those wolves moved in there, it hasn't returned, like, and the habitat's there. And so for me, as a hunter, I'm just like, wow, like, that's not kind of what we were expecting, and that's not what we were promised when wolves were introduced into Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. And now I also still am going to say that I'm going to backtrack here a little bit. It's just saying that every region's different. Yeah, every region's different, right? So like all region, all habitats, everything's different. So for what I say, what I've witnessed doesn't mean that it's going to be the exact same in southern Idaho. It's not going to be the same exact in Wyoming, because you have different habitat, different terrain. And that really, I feel like in that case, it really depends on that and what holds certain wildlife populations like deer, elk, wolf, right, whatever. But now going back to the wolves, that area was one of the first areas I saw that it almost went to be in a dead zone. Right. And I'm like, man, this is one of my favorite mule deer spots. Why did this happen? And then I saw, and then I'd say it was about 2011 is when the first wolf season kicked in, right? And we started seeing more and more wolf activity showing up in these drainages that, that we've killed elk for years. And they just went desolate, and we just would no longer get trail camera photos. And the elk would stop using the water, like the watering holes, the trail systems, all those trail systems that move through the thick timber, thick brush. They would just go vacant. And but where we would notice it the most was the wintering range, because I'm a shed hunter too. So as much as I love to hunt, I actually enjoy picking up sheds. But this is where it was a little more evident, where you go in these wintering ranges, where the elk, moose, mule deer, they're all vulnerable, right? They pull to a certain part of the mountain where they can at least trudge through the snow. And when a wolf pack moved through, they would just hammer them. And you would just, like, when I used to find sheds, I'd find carcasses. And friends of mine that would be snowmobiling, they'd find moose still alive, and they'd have their innards hanging out, dragging on the roads, and with a bunch of wolf tracks. Like, the wolves would play with the moose, and they just kind of give up on the moose and run off. And here's a moose that's half dead. And then they'd come back to it later, like snowmobile, come back later, and the wolves never finished it off. It's just like, I mean, and that's just nature, right? Nature kills. That, nature's brutal, and I understand that. But what we were saying is, the evidence was there. We saw what wolves were doing. We watched, like, really healthy populations in certain areas just completely go desolate. And even to this day, I've gone back to some of these places where wolves first moved in back in 2010, and some of these drainages that I noticed, and they still haven't recovered. But I will say this, though, that I am seeing some areas recovering, but we do have some heavy wolf hunting and heavy trapping going on too. So,
yeah. a number of things that, first off, thanks for that background. There are a number of things that it seems that it's almost like people don't want to get on the same page with. So one thing that I've heard from some fish and game people is like, hey, look, wolves don't kill for fun. It's not for sport. It's not, that's not reality. But what you're talking about is something that I've heard reiterated by other people who are trying to manage wolves. One guy in particular, Seth Simpson, who he trains dogs, in avid coyote and wolf hunter, and at times he's been paid to go, essentially try to get wolves off of certain ranch where they were had cattle, and he said he would stay out there for like 4 or 5 nights, waiting. And then like the one night he would go and sleep in a bed somewhere, they'd wake up the next day and there'd be a dead animal. And the animal was not consumed. It wasn't, like stripped down. The carcass was pretty intact, and they would be able to do a necropsy and realize like, okay, this was obviously a wolf kill, and the wolf did not consume it. So his experience was very similar to yours, which is he trains hunting dogs. He's like, look, dogs are like us to a very large degree. They're interested in hunting. They're interested in playing around with these things. It's like you see kittens going after, spools of yarn, and it's like they're practicing jumping on mice and whatnot. Right. So you have dogs that, like domesticated dogs, that enjoy hunting and love hunting and practice. And he's like, wolves are the exact same thing. They need to practice. They need to try really hard to, get after, teach skill sets to their pups. And they themselves enjoy the act of hunting. And it's like, well, yeah, I enjoy hunting too. Like I could relate to that. So the idea that, hey, look, it's never the kind of thing where like wolves never kill things without the intention of eating it. I think that's, to some degree, I think that's a disingenuous comment. And it could be, somebody could say, hey, I've never seen that. I've never seen a wolf kill without the intention of eating it. And that's a totally fine statement. But to make a blanket statement, say it never happens, again, I think that's just not really taking into account, even anecdotal evidence. It's like, no, I've seen it. Like, here's a picture. Like, here's a moose that was gutted or hamstrung, died. Nobody came back to eat it.
Yeah. And I also think too, sometimes they'll surrender. Like I was kind of telling you there, I had a friend who he actually followed the elk, like he was shed hunting, and wolf pack was working on this elk, ripped out the hamstrings. And again, I think the elk or the wolves just kind of surrendered on the elk and they just moved on. But so my friend just kept following that blood trail, and he followed it down till the elk died, and the elk was hamstrung. And so I don't think it's always really hard, right, to know the reason why wolves do something. Like, are they doing it for fun? And for me, it makes sense because dogs, you throw a chew toy, dog chases it, right?
Right.
They enjoy that fun. And I've watched wolves, like they go for too. Like they like to eat small game as well. I've seen them do that. But going back to that, I also think sometimes they'll surrender on a kill, and they do have to work a little bit harder, I feel like, than a mountain lion does. Mountain lion, I still consider mountain lion are one of the best killers, and they're really quick at it. Wolves, they have to run the animal down. They start ripping piece by piece off the animal until they knock it down,
Right.
But like mountain lion kills, I've seen a lot of them where they, just because I do some hunting for mountain lions in the winter as well with hounds, and you'll see some cats where it's literally 20 pounces or less, and the deer's dead, and it's right there. You know what I mean? That there's hardly a struggle. And then going back to this too, so I've seen one single wolf eat an entire deer, bones and all. So it's just,
wait, how long did that take?
I had a trail camera. So there was a section where I had this deer trail, and I was like, I set these trail cameras up for these deer. Now I was getting a lot of really nice whitetail bucks down in the lower elevation. And this one single wolf came through, and this one was actually kind of an ambush. Like this wolf, it seemed like from where he started to run and from when he caught the deer was actually pretty quick. So that was actually not much of a struggle. But all that was left of that deer there was just chunks of bone all the way up and just a blood splat. Like that was it on the snow. And there was one antler Like he left one antler. He must have ate the other one. But it's just like, I mean, he ate bones and all. I mean, that was one that was one full wolf. But I also too just know with wolves, like they can eat a lot in one sitting, but they can also go quite a while without eating food at all too. So it can be feast or famine for wolves too, especially in areas where there's less game. But yeah, it could go both ways. It really could. You know, I've seen it go either way with wolves. And
I gotcha.
And exactly what you said. If you just said that wolves, all that wolves do is kill for fun, that's not realistic, right? But I can't deny the fact that stuff's getting wasted, right, in a kill. And I have set trail cameras to see wolves coming back to kills, but the problem is the eagles will clean it up too quick, you know? So like wolves will make a kill, they eat and they keep moving. I've set trail cameras at there to see if they come back, and sometimes they will, but they'll come back about 2 weeks later and the eagles already have it cleaned up. So, I mean, I guess the argument could be, well, nothing gets wasted, but it's like, sure, but I can go poach 15 deer and leave them out and the eagles will clean them up. So of course nothing will go to waste, but it's just the fact that to me, it's about like, can the deer reproduce quick enough to sustain a predator like this, you know, deer, elk. And I feel like people are always focused on just elk, but what I try to tell is look at the big picture, look at mule deer, look at moose, look at everything. Mountain goats. There's one area that wolves ran, and I even swear to this day that they single-handedly wiped out the mountain goats. It was just one of those places. It wasn't like the terrain wasn't too steep to where even I can hike it, you know, and a wolf pack moved in there. And as soon as they moved in there 2 years later, you can't find a mountain goat in there anymore. And there's no hunting for mountain goats, so you can't blame it on hunting pressure. Right. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so,
yeah. And I think the point that it seems the point that you're at least in part getting at is, hey, look, can there be a natural balance that is struck between a predator and prey animals, populations, environments, all of these things? And I think that's a good question to ask, but I think it also betrays the reality, which is we're not looking for some equilibrium to be struck in 100 years on like an open plain somewhere that we're not messing around with. We very much, you know, like the wild game is property of the state of Idaho. Like it is our property as residents of Idaho and citizens of Idaho. And it's something that we rely on. It's a natural resource that we want to engage with. So yeah, fine. Like I'm sure if left to their own devices, like there would be an equilibrium struck, you know, even you see small examples of this with, rabbits, right? Rabbits move into an area, they overpopulate, they strip all of the vegetation. And then for like a year or two, there are no rabbits because all the rabbits die off from starvation. And then rabbits move back in and boom. So you have this natural fluctuation even within nature. We're not looking to engage with that cycle. Like nobody here is arguing, like we want steady, predictable supplies of fish and game that we can engage with meaningfully for food or for sport or for whatever reason we want to, you know, even for recreation, just seeing them. So I make the assumption, and again, I'm not like a wildlife biologist, but I assume there will be some balance struck eventually, but that does very little as somebody who wants to go out and hunt. That does very little for me or for you.
And I'm like I said, I'm not going to deny that's happening because it is happening in areas like it's only been 15 years that we've had wolves, right? And so it's like, okay, what does the next 20 years look like? I am seeing areas rebound. There's areas where I just don't see wolves run anymore. Like it's almost like the areas went so desolate that the wolves just had nothing to eat there anymore.
Right.
And even they could have got killed out for all I know. And wolves then all of a sudden it's just like now, you know, this year there's one place I glassed and we counted 15 bull elk and I'm like, holy smokes. It's been probably 12 to 15 years since I've seen that many elk in this one particular area. But wolves the wolves are not really running in there anymore. Now it begs the question is like, is this, because there is some trappers in that area. It's like, is the trapping working or is it just simply nature's going through its cycle?
Right. Like, are you having natural migrations? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so that is the possibility. The other thing I also want to consider, because you brought up a good point, is we do live in a man-made ecosystem. That's a fact. And, even if you actually look at northern Idaho, there used to be no elk in the majority of northern Idaho. Like a lot of the old timers that you talk to, the elk didn't even move up into these areas until the 1950s. There wasn't even an elk season until in the later 1950s. They said there just wasn't elk, and it wasn't until the logging started happening and some of the burns that were happening to where there was actually that habitat being created. And there's, and I don't necessarily know I've heard several different rumors, but there's rumors of the Knox and, elk being released there. And that's kind of what happened, and cleaning up that fireweed. But, I've asked Fish and Game, I've asked wildlife biologists about this. And so I get a different answer every time. But just what I do know, though, is elk weren't always up here in this type of habitat, and so now they live in this brushy country where, we brought them up here. And so they thrive in it. They thrive in this thick, heavy forest. They love it. But I've also known too, is that the wolves do too. And so if you actually, because I try to make sense of what I hear, and some of the podcasts that, some of the guys that you've had on your podcast, I try to make sense of everything. Right. And I'm like, okay, I try to make sense of what people are saying. And so when you actually look at the wolf harvest, where I live is the highest wolf harvest in the state of Idaho every single year. And so that tells you right there, even in the places next to Yellowstone, we have a higher wolf harvest. And so we simply just have more wolves. And for me, I'm not asking for all wolves to be annihilated. I'm asking for areas where we live, where we have an excessive amount of wolves. We just need to manage them. And we have a lot. We have a lot of wolves. And even the western side of Montana, people, like, I keep on hearing people say, oh, well, look, Montana elk are doing great. Well, if you look at the whole state, sure, but a fifth of the state actually holds wolves. A fifth. If you actually look at the maps that they have of the active wolf paths, and now, sure, a wolf is going to travel through, eastern Montana. I'm not going to deny that. But if you actually look at the maps of where these packs are concentrated, the majority of them are on a fifth of the state, which is on the west side of Montana, which is also the north side of Idaho. So it's all combined right there. And it's just that habitat. I don't know. It's hard to explain, but wolves just seem to really thrive in this heavy, thick, brushy terrain. And my logic is, because I've seen what I have seen personally with the behavior of elk and deer, is they've actually prefer being out in the openings more with wolf activity. The last last three big bulls that I killed were actually in openings. As before, the biggest bulls we would kill were in the thickest, brushiest, nasty holes you can think of. But that's where the wolves like to be, and that's where the wolves feel like they can ambush the game. So I'm finding elk now above tree line and really utilizing that tree line or the farmer's fields more than those thick brushy holes that I used to find elk in. Like the majority of those really thick, nasty places where I used to find elk, you just won't find them anymore. They're just not in there. And I'd say for us, we gained a good reputation, not just in hunting wolves, but hunting elk and mule deer in that thick, brushy country. We have a YouTube channel. It's called Stuck in the Rut. And I'm not trying to brag, but we have 250,000 followers on that channel right now as we speak. But we gained a reputation in hunting close range elk and mule deer and that thick brushy stuff. I feel like I don't want to say we mastered it, but I feel like we have in mastering that thick brushy country. I enjoy hunting it just because I know how to do it. And a lot of people don't know how, but I enjoy doing it. And I've also utilized that technique in hunting wolves too. And I've actually done quite well with it.
So you're actually leading to the next thing I want to talk to you about. What does management look like for you? Because you're saying, hey, look, we have them here. That's reality. we obviously can't undo the past, but what does management look like? Because you're not even advocating for, hey, look, eradicate them all, which great. Okay. That at the very least offers some semblance of balance for people. So what does it look like to manage?
So that's a very tough question, but I'm going to answer it for you on wolves because they reproduce so quickly, right? So management looks to me is not to eradicate, but at the same time, heavy management on wolves until we see our wildlife numbers return. Like our moose right now are struggling. Like it's the worst that I've ever seen it. You know, I mean, going back to what I used to see in these areas, we used to see 20 to 30 bull moose per drainage. Bull moose, not even talking about cow moose, bull moose, you know, wintering in each drainage throughout this landscape. And there's areas where you would be blown away. Like if you'd see a moose, you're like, wow, a moose. It's like, well, that's great. But you used to see a lot more than that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But the moose were one of the first to go. Like that was probably the first thing I saw in the landscape was our moose. Like they're very vulnerable. They're not as adaptable as elk. And when they pull into their wintering ranges, they're kind of stuck there and they don't move much. And so they get chased around by wolves, but they go back to their same food source. And that's unfortunate. And then on our mule deer, I've seen it where, you know, our mule deer are stubborn, right? So they find a bench on the hillside and they'll, you know, when I find mule deer sheds, they're dropping their racks belly deep snow, and they won't pull down. And so they put themselves in these little timber patches, and we've nicknamed these trail systems poop trails because what they do is as the snow gets deeper, they keep using these trails. As they use those trails, that keeps piling up and they're able to reach the moss higher and higher in the trees. And when it all melts in the spring, what you'll see are these trails literally of poop. It's just these poop trails. And so when you find those, that's when we start looking for mule deer sheds, right? Well, what was happening is the wolves would find that elevation and they would hit that elevation. They'd get in that patch. There'd be like 7 or 8 bucks wintering in there. And it's like, they're done. They're not getting out of that. You know, they've used those poop trails all winter long and they can't go down. They can't go up. they're stuck there. And they hit those vulnerable species. So like, you know, that we also had that caribou species that went extinct too, which they were struggling already, but it didn't help having wolves.
And in fact, sorry, I'm not familiar with them. What species went extinct of caribou here?
So we had the last caribou in Idaho was in our area. The last group of caribou ever to exist in the lower 48. And it was always a struggling species. It always ranged between 20 to 30 caribou. But the wolves moved in and, you know, and it was really far back to where trappers can get to, and it just pretty much finished them off. And it was pretty bad. Even my brother trapped one of the wolves, and it had a fish and game caller that was from the state of Washington. And the wildlife biologist told Trav, he said, well, if you didn't kill that wolf, we were going to have to, because that was one of the wolves that was killing off the caribou, you know. And there was another one with the fish and game caller that ended up getting killed by another friend of ours too. So, but what really hurts though, because as locals, we knew what was going on, but then as soon as the caribou went extinct, they blame it on climate change and they blamed it on logging and you know, climate change. I can't speak on that. I don't know what's going on with nature, right? But what I can speak on is logging. I can speak on logging. They haven't logged for over, let's say, 50 years. It's already been shut down for the caribou, right? So logging's been shut down. There's been no logging there. All that timber grew all back up. It's all old growth timber. And they still try to blame it on logging. And I'm just like, can't win. Can't win. Sometimes I hope it's like, okay, well, if somebody sees this, it'll be more evident, right? Like if somebody actually sees this, it'll be more evident. And I myself too, I try to stay informed. I attend, you know, if you go to the Idaho Fish and Game website or even the Montana Fish and Game website, they have public meetings where you can go in, you can personally talk to wildlife biologists and fish and game. Honestly, actually, a lot of the fish and game and wildlife biologists I talk to, they see the same things. They're seeing the same issues that I'm seeing. And I think it must be different regional, because if I talk to a fish and game officer, wildlife biologist in the region in southern Idaho, the answers I get are way different.
Right.
Way different, And so I know that.
And that's, if I may interject, don't mean to interrupt, but
Yeah.
if I may, I think that plays into one of the problems with making state level policy when you have such a difference from region to region with the effects and visibility.
Yeah, it does. Well, I'll use this prime example too. So pronghorn, right? You have pronghorn where you live?
Southwest, I don't think so. Do we? I don't think.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
It's entirely possible. Again, I'm not as well versed in the species down here as I should be.
No, it's fine. So I'll just say sagebrush country, right?
Sure.
4 hours. If I drive 4 hours, I'm in sagebrush country. I'm seeing pronghorn. I'm seeing it's a completely different landscape. Almost looks like a different planet, right? Like it's so different. If you come up where I live, we're in heavy timber. We have a lot of moisture. I mean, it almost reminds you of the coast. Like, it's just way different up here. You have different habitat. Some of the wildlife is the same, but I even questioned that our mule deer even have different body features. Like when I hunt southern Idaho for mule deer, they have more of a grayer body style. While we hunt up north, we almost have like a black tail look, like they're like a black, like more of a black body features and double throat patches and stuff. And our racks too, just different texture. Even like, because I'm a shed hunter, right? The texture of the rack is different. I noticed these small details, right? And that's one thing I've learned with being a hunter, is just being observant and understanding what's going on in your area. And in order to be a good wolf hunter too, I had to understand wolf behavior. And so that's one thing I really dug into when I first got into wolf hunting. I was like, okay, I see a problem here. And my dad always taught me growing up, if you see a problem, solve it, right? And so I'm like, I'm going to figure out this wolf hunting. I'm going to figure it out. It took me 4 years to wolf hunt. And this is actually a statistic I got from F4WM, but there was 74,000 wolf tags bought in the state of Idaho. 411 people were successful in harvesting wolves last year, and 42 people killed more than one wolf. So it shows you how hard it is to hunt wolves. I consider myself a good hunter. If even in these areas where we have struggling elk and deer populations, I'm not blaming that on my hunting success, because I'm still killing big bulls. I'm still killing big muley bucks. The bull elk and the muley I killed last year, they both aged at 8. Both of them did. So I send the tooth into Matson Labs in Missoula, Montana. They aged the tooth. So I mean, I'm still killing older age class animals. So I'm not blaming the wolves on my success, but I'm definitely seeing a number where it comes to a point where I almost want to shut down some seasons. I'm like, maybe we shouldn't have an elk season, or maybe we shouldn't have a deer season for a bit until we get this thing figured out. I know I get off topic here and I go on these tangents.
Keep going.
But going back to what you were saying, like, what does management mean for you? Is to keep the wolf numbers down as much as we can until we see these wildlife numbers return. And the great thing with wolves is if you simply back off on them, they reproduce really fast. I've seen it happen. I've seen trappers, some of the best trappers I know, they'll trap out an entire wolf pack, right? And they're like, there's no more wolves in this area. We applaud them like, hey, good job. Guess what? Next year, two breeding pairs move through, boom, wolf pack again, right? So they have between 4 to 6 pups in the litter. Some of the trappers that have had, where they've, they dissect the wolves, and I'm not trying to be too gruesome here, but they've seen even 8 in the belly. Not all of them live in the birth though. But between 4 to 6 end up surviving, and shoot, you got a new pack again. By the end of the summer, so they're usually typically born in the spring. By the end of the summer, they're able to take down elk. I've killed full grown wolves that weren't a year old, and I was convinced they were older. You know what I mean? Like they grow pretty fast. I've also killed alphas too, and there's definitely a big difference between a big male and a female, and a lot of it's just they have a big blocky head on them, right? So, but they grow big. That's the one thing I'll always say with wolves is just like you'll be amazed at the size and power of a wolf.
Right. The first time when my dad moved up to Anchorage, the first time I flew up there at the Anchorage airport, they have a bunch of stuffed taxidermy style animals as you walk in, and one is a wolf, and I always remember going in there for the first time like, holy shit, like that is a huge animal. And of course, it's behind this little glass. They had a polar bear and everything too, but yeah, it is pretty remarkable how big those animals can get.
Yeah, it is. And like I said, in their power and what they can do, and they can take one wolf can take an elk down on its own. Right. A moose, I'm sure, would take more than one. But the other thing too is just like, and there's some argument about, and I'm sure we've all heard it, right? Like they planted the wrong wolves here. We've all heard that. I
heard it 3 days ago.
Yeah. So this is the answer I got, right? And I've got it and I always ask really good. I ask wildlife biologists, I ask these guys, and this is what they've said. This is what I've gotten and what I've gathered, that it is the same species, but in regions that they live, animals, I mean, there's some form of evolution that happens over time, right? And so if you actually look at the wolves in Wisconsin, they are on average 20 pounds smaller than our wolves. And they're still considered the same species. But on average, they're 20 pounds smaller. And so there's that logic where, the wolves that were introduced down here were used to killing bigger moose, therefore they're bigger animals. They say now, and those wolves that are down there in Yellowstone, they've actually have grown some size because of having to deal with the buffalo. And so I would have to assume that there's some truth to that, but I still think a wolf's a wolf, right? A wolf's a wolf. But for me, like I said, I don't like to give blank statements like that. I don't like to say, right, they planted the wrong wolf here, unless I really get the right information. I think the reality is just, I don't think our wolves, what I really do believe, at least in our area, I don't think we ever did have wolves here. Like we just, and I'll give you, and here's my explanation, at least in our part of Idaho. I was explaining to you earlier, the elk did not move in here until the 1950s, right? Like my great grandfather lived here. I'm 4 generations here. When he lived here, there was hardly a town. There was hardly a town. How did you expect these people to eradicate the wolf population when the Model T car wasn't even introduced, or wasn't even built? How were they able to access the mountains and set trap lines throughout every single drainage and wipe out the entire wolf population? You know what I mean? I'm sure like in areas down south where you had these big places where you ran cattle, absolutely. But I just, like, even in my times when my great grandfather lived here, like he talked about there not being a lot of wildlife here. There was some deer, and then there was that herd of caribou, right? But even the moose numbers weren't even that prevalent up here until around that same time, the 1950s, 1960s. I'd say it was around the best time of the year, or the best year to hunt was around in the 1990s. Like that was the prime time. That was when there was a lot of logging operations. There was a lot of, and when you cut that timber, you have that undergrowth growing, you have the brush and all that stuff that wasn't able to get sunlight. And now you have this booming of deer and elk numbers, right? And that's what we had in the 1990s. And so I can't deny, because this is actually another conversation I've had with our wildlife biologists, that they have said that with the lack of logging now, due to fighting these environmentalist groups, it is shutting off some of our habitat for mule deer and elk. Sure, they love living in the brushy country too, but they still need that brush to feed. You know what I mean? And I will see spikes if there's a big burn that happens. Let's say there's 100 and something acres that'll burn up. After 5 years, you'll see a spike in wildlife numbers in those areas, right? But then also the wolves will move in too, and then you'll see the drop. It's just, it's a cycle. And right. Oh, what were you saying?
No, I was agreeing with you. Yeah, because again, it's, you know, the wildlife moves around, and then the predators follow around, obviously, and you have spikes where then they move in, and then you have drops when the predators get there and take them away, and then, you know, either they leave or they die, and then again you just have this ebb and flow. But again, for the average person, it's like the average person is not concerned with participating in the ebb and flow. It's like we need predictability, we need consistency for our fish and game community. Because one thing you said earlier that I want to come back to as well is we have the X factor problem that people are trying to deal with too, which is private land. And when you talk about populations of let's say elk, people say, hey, look, statewide populations are doing just fine. And I think there's a lot of evidence to support that, at least from published numbers from Fish and Game. Right now, whether or not you want to say Fish and Game is lying about it, that's not my jam. Like, I have no idea whether I have no capacity to verify or deny those numbers. But let's just, if we agree that, hey, Fish and Game is publishing numbers, those numbers say they're fine statewide, that betrays the reality of location, right? Okay, where are they fine? Is this an acceptable area? Because if you have a ton of hunters in the state saying, hey, yeah, they might be fine, they're not fine where I can go. You know, they might be, you know, 20, 30,000 of them on private land near me that I can see, that I know are there, that, you know, it's irrelevant to me. So we have again a man-made ecosystem, as you pointed out earlier. We have the introduction or introduction or reintroduction, however you want to look at it, of an apex predator, and then you have the carving up of land management and ownership within the state that precludes people from following the wildlife where the wildlife is going. So the only time then theoretically that somebody would have access is like, okay, you got an ebb and a flow. If you don't catch it on the ebb year when the, you know, wildlife comes in before the predators follow, then you hit only the predator seasons when, you know, everything gets eradicated. So like, it's really complex in flushing out, all right, what's true, what's not true, what's functional and what's not functional. Like just saying, hey, the numbers are doing all right, betrays the reality that even if they're doing all right, if they're on inaccessible or private areas, then they're not all right for the Idaho residents.
Yeah, I agree with that. Everything you just said, I agree with. And one thing I do encourage everybody here that's listening is, you know, I actually agree with a lot of the stuff. I mean, well, I know how they study. I always ask them, like, okay, how are the studies being done and stuff? And I'm glad they're actually being, especially in our country, they used to not even put trail or collars on our game, just only the grizzlies and the wolves. And it hasn't been more recently where I'm starting to see more elk. Well, a few of us guys, like at these meetings, were like, are you guys studying our elk at all? And I think we've complained enough to where finally we're seeing collars. Like I'll go in the mountains and I'll see a moose with a collar. I'm like, thank goodness, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That's what we want to see. You know, who cares about the Yeah. Like,
you know, you have a YouTube channel. I have a YouTube channel. We need to get on a Fish and Game plane when they go out and count. And we just need to record it. You know what Ada County did recently? I just found this out last night. With the elections coming up, you will be able to download and view every single ballot that's cast in Ada County. Right. So literally they're taking pictures of and they obviously black out the identification number and there's a hash on it. So someone somewhere knows which ballot that is or who owns that ballot, but we'll be able to see it. And then if people want to say, okay, well, those are fake ballots or whatever, it's like, look, I don't know what to tell you. This is the ballot. This is the count. You can go through and hand count, you know, 300,000 ballots. We should just jump on a plane with them, ask them really, really nicely, pretty please, can we come with you? And then just record everything. Like we could live stream it. It's like, I'm on the plane and, you know, here are the animals. And that way, you know, just take a little bit of the capacity for people to disagree about the methodology of counting or the actual numbers out of the game.
Yeah. And coming from, because so our family, I'm the only family member that doesn't have a pilot's license. Timber country is really tough to spot. Yeah, no, right. So people are like, why don't you get your pilot's license? I'm like, why do I need it?
God, there's always one in the family.
Yeah, there's always one in the family. My brother-in-law, he does a ton. Well, he has a bush plane in Alaska. And so him and my sister, they're always just living the dream up there.
I don't know, man. The mosquitoes up there are so terrible. Like, I mean, I'm sure you've spent quite a bit of time up there. I remember going up there a ton when I was in like, end of high school and then college, and it's just a nightmare in the summer.
Oh, it's bad. Yeah. And a nice, you actually really hope for a breeze or even a rain because it knocks them down. You know what I mean? They're like, it's like, oh, nice. It's finally calm. No wind. Bugs.
Yeah, bugs. Oh,
wait, I need the wind back. Get the wind back. Yeah.
Yeah. I was going mountain biking through some real back areas and by myself, no big deal. And I was close enough to Anchorage town. I was like, I'm only, a couple miles away, but it gets real thick real fast. And going down this one fire trail, it was all muddy and nasty. And my bike got stuck in the mud. It's like, I got big knobby tires, but I wasn't going fast enough, couldn't make it through or whatever. So I kind of stopped. I'm like, oh, got to get my bike out of this. And within 2 seconds, my arms are covered. Like, I mean, black to the point where I'm like, oh no, I start swatting them. And I realized like, oh, they're coming. Like it was like a zombie movie. Like they had like zombie mosquitoes. They just swarmed me. And I freaked out because I realized like, oh my God, I'm going to like die here in 10 seconds. So I throw my bike, like pull it up and I jump on it to try to start pedaling and I jump onto the handlebars. So now I'm keeled over on my bike because I just like got myself right in the goods. And I'm like, oh my God, and, mosquitoes going onto my eyeballs and stuff. And I like marginally pedal away. And for the next week, it was a train wreck. Like my arms and neck were just obliterated.
Oh man, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. It's just like, feel bad for me. Right. Anyway. Yeah. So I'm sorry. You were saying bush plane.
Oh yeah, no. My brother-in-law and sister, they're up in Alaska and stuff, and my family down here.
And you were, and I'm sorry, I interrupted you in the first place when you were saying you actually you don't have a problem in general with the numbers that Fish and Game puts out.
No, I don't. Like but it's how you interpret them, right? And so like if you actually look, and you look in Idaho, and you look at the areas where elk are below objective. So if you go on the Idaho Fish and Game website. And it says, there's a chart. So the unfortunate truth is we're not in the objective area, right? So there's no objective up here. They don't have a quota of like, oh, this is how many elk we need for them to be a hunting season. But below that, if you actually look at these maps where it's like, and I hope, now backing up a little bit, I hope we end up being one of those places where it's like they'll do more studies, right? But when you start going south and you start going to the Selway with Bitterroot Wilderness, the Salmon area, the Sawtooth, and you start seeing these areas where it says below objective on elk, you'll also notice in those same areas, that's where the highest wolf harvest is too. And so to me, that's very evident right there, where these areas where the elk are below objective and the Fish and Game even realize and admit that these elk numbers need brought back up. Those are also the same areas where the majority of the wolves are. Now go into Montana. We've talked about private land. Montana fights it more than Idaho. Idaho, I feel we're really fortunate with the amount of public land we have. You go into Montana. The entire east side is just private land. Lot of pieces of public land that are completely landlocked. You can't land in there, or you can land a plane or a helicopter or whatever, but that's about it. And you have to be careful. It has to only be on BLM. There's rules to that, to actually be able to hunt these places, right? And besides that, there's no road systems. Now you go to the west side of Montana, there's a lot of public land. But like I was saying, if you actually go to the more recent charts, I feel like it's pretty accurate in Montana, where it shows like the majority of the wolf populations. And it shows it like, pretty much where the way the chart is, you'll have to look at it. If any of you guys are interested, it just takes some extra time to study. People are so quick with information, but it's like, if you take time to study, and you'll come to understand this. Like, look at the west side of Montana, look how dense the wolf population is on the west side. I don't even think it's a fifth. It's more like a sixth of the state is dense, which it holds, there's 1,100 wolves in the entire state of Montana, and the majority of it's all in that sixth. It's on the west side there. And if you look at the harvest, especially up in the northwest corner, the elk harvest is massively low. And if you go up there, there's just a lot of wilderness area. And I'll use a prime example of the Cabinet Mountains. The Cabinet Mountains, that's part of my childhood too. Northwest corner of Montana, hunting the cabinets. just a dead zone, absolute dead zone. You get up in these high elevations, these big avalanche shoots that the muleys love to use, gone. Like you can't get an elk bugle. You can't, during September, you're not seeing elk trails. They're just, I'm not saying they're not there. They're just so few and far between. And where I notice it most is, when you get the deep snows and everything pulls in their wintering range, it's like, that's when you do the head count, right? That's how many animals survive the year. And that's when I do my shed hunting, right? So they pull down the mountain back in the day, and this is not even that long ago. This is back 2010, 2011, when I started really seeing wolves. We're going in these drainages, you're seeing 20 to 30 bull elk, and some of these areas, even lots of moose too, right? And they winter in these ranges. They all shed their antlers. So there's about 40, 50 plus elk antlers on the hillside, right? And now you go there and there's three elk. You looking on this south facing slope, they're all forced there because of the snow drifts. There's 3 elk. Well, when that snow met, there's 3 bull elk and maybe 18, 20 cows. When that snow melts, those elk disperse into thousands and thousands of acres when they can get back in the backcountry. And it's just like, there's nothing back there. When you're talking about 3 bull elk out of thousands and thousands of acres, it's just dead. You know what I mean? And so for us, what we want to see is just better management practices. Now, I'll say Idaho, we're in a good spot. Like, we're doing well here. I sure hope Montana gets on board a little bit better. They're really fighting these environmentalist groups and allowing us to manage wolves. And I'm seeing so going back to what I was saying earlier about, like, were these places that are rebounding, is it trapping, or is it just nature doing its cycle? What gives me the idea that it's a trapping is because if I go to the Montana side of the line, which I live very close, I actually live now, I live about 700 yards from the Montana line. So really close. You go to the Montana side, there is a night and day difference on wolf population, right? So you see that, and it's like, that to me is a night and day difference in wildlife numbers.
Gotcha. Yeah. And the idea that I had Pat Cudmore on recently, great old, I think you may have actually seen a couple of his clips. I don't know which ones we got connected on, but older dude wearing suspenders and he's got a goatee and he's just sitting back. He's like, oh, blah, blah. And he's got this cackle, which just kills me. laughs at his stories. But he worked for Fish and Game for decades and had several instances that he talked about on and off air about areas where wolves came in. There were huge populations of like elk, for instance. Those got eradicated. And one in particular, I can't remember exactly the location he was talking about, but they actually, because the elk got eradicated, they either died or they left. The wolves had to move into other areas to start eating cattle, because they were like, well, the wild game's gone. We gotta eat something. So they came in and killed the wolf packs because the ranch was like, hey guys, help us out here. They didn't in fact eradicate them. And then boom, the numbers climbed right back up in the area that had been in the first place. The elk came back, right? They either, came back or repopulated, whatever it was. But the idea that they're not having a significant impact and shouldn't be managed, or management will be unsuccessful, I think is, again, just a really disingenuous or just flat out false statement. It's very evident from all of the Fish and Game people I've spoken with and private hunters and whatnot, people like you, that's like, no, this is something we understand how to do, right? We understand how to manage populations. Now, wolves, as you're talking about and other people have said, are extremely difficult to hunt compared to other things. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be support there. That doesn't mean that there's the what's that? I'm sure what's the program that reimburses people for the cost of hunting wolves?
That's F4WM, Foundation for Wildlife Management.
Yeah. So I'm trying to have I'm trying to line things up with Kate Smalls to have her come in and talk about that, because she's engaged with it to some degree as well. But again, it's clear that it's, hey, look, citizens have to be solutions here, right? We can't look, and one thing I love about Idaho is it does not appear that this culture has grown up around the idea of government taking care of things. So what can the average person do? What can we all engage in? How can we support the actual fish and game numbers, not necessarily the entity, the organization Fish and Game, but how do we support the natural wildlife for the betterment of ourselves and our future generations? And again, that's something that does fall on us.
Well, yeah, and that's why I really love the foundation, because those actually started in our neck of the woods, So, and it's grown tremendously because so many people saw a wolf issue,
Yeah.
And
yeah.
And again, if you talk to the board, or I forget the title, but he's pretty much the head of the foundation, Justin Webb. He himself will say the goal of this is not to eradicate the wolf, but to manage them. He said that, do you remember the time when it said Idaho's going to wipe out 90% of the wolves? You remember that? It was a while ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then it just went all over. It went to New York Times and whatever, and just made a big deal. He said Justin Webb was with a bunch of, just like a bunch of state leaders and whatever. And I don't know how all these laws get passed. But anyways, he was in that room, and one environmentalist, I guess, was in the room, and they're just like, because what they were mentioning was that Idaho, like, originally was supposed to have 500 wolves, right? I think between Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, parts of Washington, parts of Oregon, parts of Utah, a total, they said, with 30 years of study, they said roughly about 1,100 wolves should be on the landscape. Like that should be that, like, we have enough landscape to sustain 1,100 wolves. And now in Idaho, we have 1,500. Last I checked was 1,500. Montana alone is at 1,100, and that's a sixth of the state. That's a sixth of the state. And so, and so what the foundation is, because we look at mountain lions and how good they can kill. And why aren't we pushing that? It's because they're an easier predator to manage. And look, Idaho, you can buy a tag over the counter and kill a mountain lion, but we don't have them eradicated because they're an easier predator to manage. Wolves are just so challenging to manage. We have that many wolves, and yet I was telling you that only 42 people actually killed more than 2 wolves. Only 42 out of 70,000 tags that are purchased. I mean, it's such a tough animal hunt. I actually didn't start seeing, like, I consider myself part of the 42 now, but the first 4 years was a challenge. I tell you what. But probably my biggest turning point was when I got ambushed, and you're not going to believe this story, but I got photos, the proof's in the pudding. So I was elk hunting. Typical elk story, right? So I was hiking in this drainage, and there was just no bugles going on that day. And I was seeing elk tracks. I knew the elk were there, and it was quite a while. It was a little over a week. I haven't heard a single elk bugle, and I'm just like, man, this was when the wolf population was just at its peak, right? This is where I was really starting to get frustrated being an elk hunter. And I was in this thick brushy patch, and I'm like, well, usually there's a wallow in this draw. I'll go in there, I'll cow call. With those who don't know, I just have an elk reed in my mouth, and I'm making the sound of a cow elk, right? So I'm going in there, cow calling. I'm making a lot of noise, not on purpose, but I'm trying to cover up my sound with the call, right? Well, as I'm moving through, I'm like, yeah, you ever get that feeling of like something staring at you?
Yeah.
You don't know it. So I had that feeling, right? And I was like, okay. And I kind of ignore the feeling, but then I'm like, okay, I can't ignore it anymore. And I look to my left, and there is a wolf at a full trot toward me. And all I could do, I have my bow in hand. I'm like, I just got an arrow knocked, pulled back, and I just stuck the wolf point blank. I mean, he was probably, I'd like to say, varies between 10 to 8 yards, really close, just right there. And, he wasn't out to attack me, but he was just like, he heard the cow call. So he's on a trot like this, right? And then if I remember right, my mind's kind of foggy, but it's like, all I remember is just like, it was almost like wait, you're not an elk. Like, that was kind of the look he was giving me when I stuck him. He took off, took about 2 leaps, tipped over dead, right? And a whole pack came out of the brush. I thought it was just him, but the whole pack came out and was sniffing the dead wolf. We're like, what's going on? I'm like, get another arrow, pull back. And yeah, so, and I see the neck, and I'm like, gosh, that's not a good shot, but it's a wolf. I was so frustrated with wolves that day. I was just like, and I hit it in the neck, and usually that's kind of an iffy shot because you can miss, like there's a lot of meat there, and if you hit it wrong, it's not going to die. But I just straight up spined it right there, and it just tipped over. With the quick yelp, and it tipped over right nearly on top of the wolf I just killed. I'm like, what? I can't believe what's happening here. And then there was two more I see. One dispersed to the right. Couldn't see it anymore. The one dispersed to the left. I knock another arrow, and I'm like, all right, here we go. Oh, this is all under, everything here is going all under 20 yards here. So this is about 20 yards when I shot this third one. I stick the third one, and it yelped, and it ran right past me. I could see it bleeding pretty hard, and it tipped over like it would run, tip over, and then just disappeared in the alder brush. And I was just like, I think in the moment, like I was able to keep myself calm, but after that, like all the adrenaline kicked in, and I had to just like, it was just so overwhelming. I had to sit down and just lean against the tree and just like, holy crap, what just happened? So anyways, so then I ended up, unfortunately I couldn't find the third wolf. I searched, and then we had a rainstorm that was going on right at the time. And so I was just like, I lost the blood, and I just felt really uncomfortable. I was pretty convinced it died. I watched it tip over, like he was losing consciousness. I was like, I'll just skin out the two. So I skinned out the two, and I took a couple. I just like, all I could do is just film the aftermath of the situation because everything happened so fast. So I didn't really, I couldn't get the whole cool event on film, but I just filmed like, there's my bow, there's my dead wolves. I had my empty quiver, and it was kind of a crazy experience. But at that time, it was just like, that was my turning point of like, I need to figure this out. Right. You know what I mean? So that was, and then I finally felt like I did, and now I show a little bit more consistency with it. So yeah, but it was one of the craziest experiences. And now I actually I don't want to say it like this, but I actually enjoy hunting wolves. Like, it's actually fun. I actually get more.
I don't think you're a bad person for saying that. Like, okay, I think you should be allowed to enjoy hunting wolves. Like,
I do.
Like, like Seth, again, my buddy Seth, who does coyote and wolf hunting, he was telling me that when he goes coyote hunting, it's too easy in his mind now to do it with guns. So, and he doesn't even do bows. He just uses his dogs. So he has like teams of dogs. He's got jag hounds and then decoy dogs. And he's got, he'll let a decoy dog go off over a hill. He can't even see it. And then, he'll click it, and he's got a little remote, clicks the collar, comes back. But it's a whole big thing. He's like, the probability of us being successful is very, very low. It's like with a gun, it's almost a joke. But doing it exclusively with these teams of dogs that he loves and he breeds and he really cares for and trains them just at an expert world-class level, that's enjoyable to him. Like, if somebody says, hey, look, you're a bad person for enjoying hunting the wolf, but you're not a bad person for enjoying hunting a coyote or a mountain lion or an elk, right? Like, you're morally righteous for hunting a moose, but you're a bad person for hunting. It's like, come on, man. Like, that's all
you got to do is look at our YouTube channel. You look at my wolf hunts. So I do have wolf hunts on video, by the way. So the ones that I have captured on film, I do have them. If you look at those, read the comments. Look at how many unlikes I got. You go to my
That's your videos. Problem, Tom. That's your problem. Don't read the comments ever. They're Russian bots for all I know. Like, I have no idea. You can't put any credence in what somebody says online.
Oh, you can't. No, you can't. But But if you go to the elk, if you go to the elk videos and the deer videos, whole different level. Even hunters. I get hunters that hate me for shooting wolves. They're just like, I only hunt because I only hunt what I eat. And I'm like, I eat elk, therefore I hunt wolves. Like I can't, I feel like this is my logic, and I grew up this way, right? So apologies. No, I'm not apologizing. So we grew up like my dad kind of taught us, like, and this was before the wolves, right? So like, man,
Sure.
we just were always taught to do our part in predator management, manage
Sure.
bears. Bears are big calf killers. I've watched them on hillsides kill elk. Manage mountain lions, and because if we want to partake, if we want to take, we have to give back, and our way of giving back is to manage a predator, and also restoring habitat. A lot of the fire reduction, a lot of these programs I do, and what I do for work, and I think I told you with forest management. I'm restoring habitat for wildlife, and
Right.
and I even go beyond what I'm supposed to do. Like, for example, I was telling you my own property I have, more than just spacing out the trees and getting rid of the weak trees. I'm actually going to replant it in really good browse for wildlife. That's for me, I enjoy that, and a lot of like the places that I consider as like one of my favorite places to hunt were my dad's old logging jobs back in the day, because my dad in the 90s had a big logging operation, and a lot of these big logging jobs that he did, like, it created really good habitat. So a lot of my hunting success came from my own dad's logging jobs. You know what I mean? Where
Yeah.
4 or 5 years later, the feed showed up, the trees were no longer choking out the browse, and the wildlife would just move in thick. So anyways, I think I just, for more or less, like with wolves, if you guys are wanting to help, I think kind of get to the point here, I definitely would say join F4WM, be a part of be a part of the solution. It's hard to hunt wolves. So if you can't go out, that's all right. There's hunters and trappers out there that are just out all the time trapping wolves. And a really good friend of ours, I won't say his name. He doesn't like that being publicized, but him and his son have trapped over 100 wolves in Idaho, over 100 wolves in Idaho. And, this is a man who puts in a lot of time, a lot of money into trapping. And I've seen, like, some of these areas he's trapped, I'm seeing a rebound come back. And so I'm like, for me, I'm like, this is what the cause is going for, is guys like that. In those state, like I said, if you go in the F4WM and you see where where the reimbursement program's taking place at, and then going to the Idaho Fish and Game website and seeing where the elk are below objective, it matches up, right? Like, they're trying to bring elk numbers back in those areas. And then also where there's chronic livestock, what is it called? Chronic livestock depredation or something like that, where the wolves are killing off the livestock. Those areas too, like, they're really helping out in that way, shape, or form.
Again, like, what a great program. It's like empowering
really
individual citizens, coming together as a community for the betterment, not relying on necessarily government programs or things like that. I think that's awesome.
Yeah, they're great. And so, and then they say, because the thing is, if it wasn't us, you're paying Fish Game, you're paying wildlife biologists to do the hunting and trapping. Like I was telling you, where my brother killed that wolf, they said, well, if you didn't do it, we were going to have to, right? And they've said on average it cost him $9,000 per wolf to kill for a government official.
Sure.
And so if they found that, what they have found is like, well, if we instead, so the state actually funds a little bit of the foundation for a little bit, like some of the funds go to it, to where, well, why don't we just pay a hunter or a trapper who's passionate enough to go out? Let's pay him $1,000 rather than paying a government official $9,000. You know what I mean?
Right.
Big money savings there.
Yeah. Not just fiscal, but I mean, it's such a better option, and again, empowering people and making that happen. Well, Tom, listen, I so appreciate you. I feel like we can keep talking here, but I really we gotta call for this first one. We've talked for over an hour. I have a ton more questions, so this has absolutely got to be the first of many. If this is tolerable enough for you, I'd love to connect again and talk about different things besides F4WM, but perhaps even get into the nuances of all the things that you've learned from hunting wolves, and like kind of sharing the tricks of the trade, if so to speak, with other people if you'd be game.
Yeah, absolutely, man, and thank you for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, they can find you on Stuck in the Rut on Instagram, and then Stuck in the Rut on YouTube. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. And then we do have a website where we do training camps too. So
Great.
stuckandrut.com. We do a wolf
Fantastic.
camp, which we were talking about Katie Smalls. I do that camp
Yeah.
with her.
Oh,
And her,
fantastic.
yeah, and Justin Smalls, her husband. And yeah, so we do a wolf camp there. We do some elk camps, and hopefully we're going to do some more here soon too. So just hoping people get more involved in the outdoors. I feel like that's really important for Idaho, right? To
Yeah,
get
right.
people involved. And for me, I enjoy. Thank you for having me on this podcast. For me, it's just like it's just important for people to be informed and to look at a different side and a different perspective. But I'd say if there's one thing to take out of this is really like to go on to do some research and to go onto the Idaho Fish and Game website, look at the statistics in each area. I mean, if you guys really want to see like, okay, where areas are really struggling, I mean, I'd look in the studies of the Selway, look in the studies of the Bitterroot Wilderness, the Clearwater, those places like that. Like these are places that really struggle. And so, like if anyone has any time to do the research before making some assumptions that wolves aren't the problem, right? And I know there's a lot of factors,
Right.
weather, bad winters, disease,
Sure.
but I'd say like really look into stuff like that before, making an
Yeah.
assumption, I guess. And so,
Oh yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And again, anybody who's like, hey, this is impossible, this doesn't happen, be that, sport hunting with wolves or wolves having effect on wildlife numbers is like, all right, look, the answer is obviously a mix of all of these things. And for people that just want to eliminate it from possibility and not have the conversation, it's, again, they don't want to have the conversations. It's fine. They can't be part of it. Then we all have to,
yeah.
we all have to come together to some degree and try to communicate and figure out what works. So again, Tom, thank you. I appreciate you. And we'll do it again.
All right. Thanks.
MTU Studios is the proud producer for the Ada County Sheriff Podcast, the Idaho Wildlife Federation Podcast, the State Representative Ted Hill Podcast, the Idaho State PTA Podcast, and many more. If you or your organization is thinking about starting a podcast, MTU Studios would love to help. Just check out mtustudios.com.